There is a new expression, well, not really new anymore, but a common expression nowadays called a work spouse, or some people use the term work marriage. Office husband or office wife. And office wife goes back to like the 30s. But it's a phrase that is used of a co-worker, usually of the opposite sex, with which there's a special relationship. And at least on Wikipedia, which I know it's not the greatest source, but it gives us a common definition, maybe. You'll notice it says, having bonds similar to those of marriage. It's a term that when I first heard it, I thought, that's horrible. That would be a common thought. But in 2006, there was a survey that was done, and 32% of workers said that they had either an office husband or an office wife. 1/3 of all workers have this special relationship. In a CNN Money article, it characterized the relationship as having the immediate intimacy of marriage without the sex or the commitment. Does it bother you? It's so common now that a woman named, I think, Ayn Kane wrote an article that said 13 signs that you have a work spouse even if it doesn't feel like it. So her 13 signs are that, first of all, you're inseparable at work and outside in the real world. That you've got tons of inside jokes, that you gossip together, that you go to that person first. That one bothers me. That you go to that person first. You know their secrets and they know yours. This is why it's often described as an intimate relationship. The next one she writes of is that you're real with them, that you help each other out, that you stick by them at social events, that you think about them a lot outside of work, that you're terrified of them meeting your real significant other. And there's a part of me that just cringed. Your real significant other? You talk about them constantly. Usually, I guess that's among your friends. And you're a great team. This article didn't help my idea of what this means to be a work spouse. When the Bible talks about marriage, as we talked about last week, the Bible tells us that when God created man and put him in the garden, it was not good for him to be alone. So from the rib, he created Eve. And the definitive statement in the Bible in Genesis 2, verse 24, tells us what marriage is about. That a man shall leave his father and his mother. They will hold fast to his wife, and they become one flesh. Jesus quotes that, and he reminds the people that since they're now one flesh, what God has joined together, let not man separate. Have you ever wondered who are the men who separate marriages? It's not those outside. It's the husband and the wife that end up separating the marriage, isn't it? In almost every case, they're the ones who are involved in that. In the book of Malachi, the last book of the Old Testament, when the men at that time had been unfaithful to their wives, God reminds them of the relationship that they are to have with their wives, that they are companions and that they have a covenant agreement together. But he also makes the point that they had been faithless in that relationship. That faithlessness was seen in the fact that they had divorced their wives and gone to other women. And depending on your translation, you'll see that term faithless or other words in that passage as being treachery, or that they have done violence, or that they have betrayed. It's a strong word, meaning someone who doesn't honor an agreement. And clearly in these passages, that there is an agreement between the man and the woman, and God is involved in that. What God has put together, let no man separate. But unfortunately, I think because of how we've developed in our society in many ways, we've taught our kids that faithlessness is okay in marriage. So when we go back to our passage in Matthew, the 5th chapter, where Jesus talks about lust and divorce. And in this passage, you recall, he's trying to define for us what true righteousness is about, as opposed to the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees. He uses the example we see in verse 27. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery, but I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right hand causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away, for it's better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away, for it's better that you lose one of your members than your whole body go into hell. It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So as we talked about last week, the example Jesus uses here is the Old Testament said, don't commit adultery. And the scribes and the Pharisees had found a way around it where they had so narrowly defined adultery that it had a very specific meaning, and they lost the point that God was making. So Jesus clarifies that. Adultery is not just a physical act, it's something that springs from the heart, the lust that's in the heart. And so a man can commit, or a woman can commit, adultery by lusting within their heart. Well, the other example that he gives is divorce. And I pointed out last week, divorce is a subtle form of adultery. It seems to have been given some legitimacy as far as the scribes and the Pharisees were concerned by the fact that you could hand your wife a certificate of divorce. And so everything's okay, and now I can go marry the woman that I want. But there's still a high degree of faithlessness, just like at the time of Malachi, when you have that kind of an attitude. Your heart is still in the wrong place. So the certificate or the writing of divorce was an excuse, a rationalization for faithlessness. As I pointed out last week, this passage, if all we learn from these things is that, well, I shouldn't commit adultery, and I shouldn't lust, I shouldn't divorce, and I should take drastic measures to get rid of sin, then I think we're as blind as the scribes and the Pharisees. But we need to look even deeper and see what is the principle behind this. And as I talked about, I think ultimately that principle is that God is faithful. A concept that we find throughout the scriptures, we're constantly reminded of, that God is faithful. There's a reason that I picked this picture. What's in this picture that reminds us that God is faithful? Right? The rainbow reminds us God made a promise, I'll never destroy the world again with water. Has he been faithful to that promise? Of course. But it's also the rock. And that's why I picked it, because there's two reasons. In Deuteronomy, the 32nd chapter and verse 4, God is described this way. The rock, his work is perfect. All his ways are justice, a God of faithfulness and without iniquity, just and upright is he. Our God is a rock. It's something solid. You can depend upon him. But when we say God is faithful, what do we mean? Do we just mean God keeps his promises? Is that all there is to saying God is faithful? I really appreciate Earl leading the song that you just did. I hadn't planned on this, but it really fits well with the lesson. But great is your faithfulness. You know, this song is based on a scripture in the book of Lamentations. That the book of Lamentations was written by Jeremiah after Jerusalem was destroyed, and he still looks to God and says, God, you're faithful. He says, every morning I see that faithfulness. But as described in this, there's a beautiful picture of that faithfulness of God that you see in the first verse that God doesn't change. So that's an important part of it. In the second verse, you see it described in how God takes care of us on a seasonal basis. That in this world, we have the summer and winter and springtime and harvest. All these things work together. The moon, the stars, all nature says God is faithful because he created all these things for us. So every day, God is faithful for us in providing the blessings that we need for this life. The last verse talks about the pardon for sin, the peace that endures, strength for today, the blessings that God gives us. When we think of God's faithfulness, it's not just saying, God makes a promise and he keeps it. He actively does what is best for us, what is right for his people. And it's really based not just on, well, I made a promise, I have to keep it. It's based on a relationship. I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And so the faithfulness is relationship-based. Isn't that what we see in the book of Hosea? Where the idea of Hosea and Gomer being married together and the unfaithfulness of Gomer in that case was used to talk about the relationship between God and Israel when Israel was being faithless. But of course, Hosea, what does it point to? Eventually, it points to Christ and the church and the marriage relationship that we see there. Again, the picture is of faithfulness within a relationship. Even in Malachi, the last book in the Bible, what is the picture of the relationship there? A little different one, but it's of a master and a servant. God is the master. He deserves that the people be faithful. And interestingly, it's that analogy that Paul uses in 1 Corinthians, the 4th chapter, verses 1 and 2, when he says, this is how one should regard us as servants of Christ and stewards of the mystery of Christ. Moreover, it is required of stewards that they be found faithful. Faithfulness defines, in part, who God is. Faithfulness ought to define me. So when I was thinking about this lesson, how we were going to apply the idea of faithfulness, I thought, let's keep it in the context of marriage. And I asked myself this question: how do I demonstrate faithfulness to my wife? So of course, for some of you, you have to change the genders in there, but you see the point, right? How do I know God is faithful? He shows it to me every day by the blessings that he gives me. Can I do that same thing in my relationship? That I take faithfulness beyond just, well, I don't do anything wrong. So in other words, I'm saying, well, I didn't lust today, or I didn't commit adultery today, so therefore I must have been faithful. That it's more than just saying, well, I didn't break any promises, so I must be okay. Can we take it the next step so we're more like God in demonstrating our faithfulness to God? Is it necessary? I say it's imperative. Many of us, because we're human and because we're weak sometimes, we struggle with questions and doubts and concerns. And no matter how strong a relationship is, there are always, for some of us, those questions that come up. And the reason is because infidelity, faithlessness, is rampant in our country. And opportunities for infidelity abound in our society. The very idea of a work spouse fits in perfect with what the Scribes and the Pharisees were doing, doesn't it? It's okay that I have this intimate bond like marriage with this person because there's no sex. It's exactly what the Scribes and the Pharisees were doing. That intimacy, that bond like marriage, that says that you're not being faithful to your wife or to your husband. So, are you faithful to your spouse? And how does your spouse know? In particular, how do they know every day that you're faithful to them? So I want us to turn to the book of Proverbs, the 5th chapter, the passage that Joey read a little bit earlier, and use this as three ideas, three ways that we can see this faithfulness in marriage. And this comes from the instruction that Solomon gives in the very context of avoiding adultery. And so this is advice that Solomon is giving to his son about how to maintain the relationship. And I think we see some keys in this. So, beginning at verse 15. Drink water from your own cistern, flowing water from your own well. Should your springs be scattered abroad, streams of water in the street, let them be for you yourself alone, and not strangers with you. We're going to stop there. Here's the first one that I see, and that is contentment. One way that you can show to your spouse that you are faithful to them is by being content with them. The picture that he gives in this passage is of going to your own well or to your own cistern. In other words, there's lots of places you can get water. There's only one that's yours. We have so many expressions for the struggle that we have with the grass that's greener, the water that's sweeter, the idea that whatever I have is not as good as what someone else has. And I think that's one of the things that he's reminding us of here is drink from your own cistern. Be content with what you have. Not because it's less, but because that's what God has blessed you with. There's part of this expression that I think sometimes we miss because of the way our translations have done some passages. In the instructions for an elder, one of the qualities that's necessary is that he be the husband of one wife. We all know that, right? Okay. Literally, if you were to, I'm told this because I don't know the Greek, okay, but I've told this and seen this over and over again, that the expression there, if you did it word for word, would be a one-woman man or a one-wife husband, because woman and man, husband and man, you have to go on the context. But the key is, don't you like that expression? A one-woman man. There is no other woman but my wife. That expression is exactly the same that Paul uses in Timothy just a few chapters later when he talks about the widow who is able to be supported by the church. She is to have been the wife of one husband. In that passage, the literal translation is that she is to be a one-man woman. That's what I want us to think about being. Be a one-man woman. Be a one-woman man. Be loyal in that sense. Drink water from your own cistern. That's the kind of loyalty that we need. Can your spouse see that? I think they can see it clearly in the way that you act towards other people. Be that way. Now, you'll notice also that he makes an interesting point in verse 18. Should your springs be scattered abroad, streams of water in the street? The picture here is of waste, right? Of spreading something out flippantly, of just letting it go, wasting it. If you engage in flirtatious behavior with other people who are not your spouse, what's left for your spouse? If you engage in intimate behavior with your work spouse, how much is left for your spouse? You're taking those things that are intended for your marriage relationship and you're spreading them around. And don't say to me, well, we're not having sex. That's the trap the Pharisees fell into. You're spreading around the relationship, the love, the intimacy that God intended there to be a marriage, where we become one flesh. Be careful about that. And he goes on. Let them be for yourself alone and not for strangers with you. There's a sense in which I think it's important that we don't neglect each other, that your spouse needs to have a higher priority than your career or your job, than your children, than your hobbies, than anything else. Now, the only exception to that is God, of course. But even be careful. There's a little trap in that also, because some people have used the excuse, well, I'm doing this for God, to neglect their wife. If you obey God, you take care of your husband or your wife, your spouse. You do what needs to be done. Putting God highest means living correctly. Wives, submit to your husbands. Husbands, love your wives. You have to do that. So don't neglect those things. So how can we do this? I want to suggest to you that you choose each day to positively influence your relationship, to work on it. Decide that you're going to do something to improve it. No matter how good you think your relationship is, no matter how bad you might think your relationship is, think about something that you can do every day that will improve that relationship. Now, where I get this idea is from a book that I didn't read. It's honest, right? But the idea behind the book, it was called The Love Dare, and I just couldn't get really through it. But it has the essence of a great idea. It tells the story of a man who's ready to divorce his wife, and I think it's his father or someone challenges him to do something for 30 days so that what would happen at the end? Maybe it was his wife. But anyway, and the challenge in the Love Dare is that each day you would take something from 1 Corinthians 13 where it says love is, kind, love is patient, that each day you would act out one of those things to that person. No matter what they do, no matter how they act, no matter how they react to it, you dedicate that day to that quality. I love that idea. I think it's in part what we should be doing every day, isn't it? Of course, all of them together. But sometimes because of the busyness of life, we get so overwhelmed we forget, especially with the ones that we are closest to do those things that are truly love. Now, if you don't like 1 Corinthians 13, do the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians 5. That one will work too. But you see the point. Find something every day and say, this is how I'm going to make my marriage better. This is what I'm doing today. Don't be off-put by their reaction. Do it and keep doing it every day. I think that's a part of the contentment and finding that place. The second thing that Solomon talks about is to rejoice. If you will, read with me in Proverbs 5, verses 18 and 19. Where he says, let your fountain be blessed and rejoice in the wife of your youth. A lovely deer, a graceful doe. Let her breast fill you at all times with delight. Be intoxicated always in her love. Why should you be intoxicated, my son, with a forbidden woman and embrace the bosom of an adulteress? So here we clearly have the idea of rejoicing in our spouse. And the analogy that's given is like a deer. And if you find it awkward as a man, it's okay. In the Song of Solomon, that analogy is used for the man. So think of your wife, think of your husband as lovely and graceful, as something beautiful. Do we actually forget to do that sometimes? I think we do. Again, it's a part of coming down to the busyness of life and being complacent about our relationships with each other, that we forget to really look at each other with those eyes of when we were young. And that's part of what he brings out in this passage also. Now, in 1 Peter, the 3rd chapter, you'll recall that he talks about how a wife can do this for the husband and how the husband can do this for the wife. In 1 Peter 3, it says that the woman's conduct is what she needs to look at, that she be respectful and pure. That what makes her beautiful is not the outward adorning, but it is the hidden person of the heart, of a gentle and a quiet spirit. Husbands, when you compliment your wives, do you compliment them based on how they look or who they are? The first one doesn't hurt, but the second one is the one that's really important. Compliment your wife on who she is. If she's a daughter of God, if she's following after him, if she's doing what she can to follow him, compliment her for those things, the hidden person of the heart. It's hard for us to do sometimes, but it's important. In 1 Peter 3, verse 7, by the way, the obverse of that also works. Women don't just focus on the outward beauty. We appreciate it, but focus on the inward beauty. It's so much more important than that. 1 Peter 3, verse 7 reminds husbands that they are to live with their wives in an understanding way. That, I don't think, means that you have to understand why your wife does things. Okay? If it does, I'm in so much trouble. Because Connie and I clearly think differently. And I'm okay with that. I like how the ESV translates that. Live with her in an understanding way, which means you have concern for her needs and desires, that you are respectful of her, that you have compassion towards her, that you are merciful towards her. You can show that a lot of times, that kind of respect, just by listening. By listening to your wife, you say, I care what you think, I care what's going on in your life. You're living with her in an understanding way. It says in 1 Peter 3 that we are to honor the woman as the weaker vessel. And again, I think the concept of honoring the wife as the weaker vessel is reminding husbands that your wife is a precious dish, a piece of china. It's the kind of thing that you understand it's precious, it's valuable, it's fragile. And so you give honor to that you say, my wife is special. Put her up on a pedestal. Honor your wife in that way. And then the last thing he reminds us is, your wife is an heir with you. She's a brother or sister in Christ. Understand that a part of rejoicing, especially in a marriage between two who are Christians, is that we're not just husband and wife, we're brother and sister. We can help each other get to heaven. And we need to honor each other for that reason in our relationship. So, going back to Proverbs, the 5th chapter, you'll see, not only does he say, rejoice in the wife of your youth, he talks about by the way, I love that expression, the wife of the youth, don't you? Because of that comfortable feeling that we get, where we sometimes lose the excitement from when we were dating, we get so complacent about the relationship. Ephesians 5 tells us what are wives to do. Submit to your husbands and respect them. Husbands, love your wives and give yourself up for them. Nourish and cherish your wife. But why? Because you are one flesh. We need to go back to that idea that we are united together for a reason. Remember the youthful joy of your relationship that says we came together for a reason before God. We're united together to serve him and serve his purpose. I think also of Colossians, the 3rd chapter, verses 18 and 19. Colossians, the 3rd chapter, verses 18 and 19 says, wives, submit to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord, and husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them. So, very similar to Ephesians. But that submission is really important. That willingness to follow the lead of your husband. Turn with me a few chapters over in Proverbs, the 27th chapter. That submissive idea is so different from what often happens in marriages, that we become critical and contentious with each other. In Proverbs, the 27th chapter, verse 15 and 16. Proverbs 27, 15 and 16. A continual dripping on a rainy day and a quarrelsome wife are alike. Now, the word quarrelsome in this passage, depending on your translation, may be contentious. The idea behind this word is that you are trying to rule over your husband, that you are fighting for ring number one in the relationship. Listen to what he goes on to say. To restrain her is to restrain the wind, or to grasp oil in one's right hand. Here you have a picture of a husband trying to restrain his wife, grasping the wind. You don't get anything. Holding oil in your hand, you get an oily hand, but you don't have anything there. A wife who's constantly causing her husband problems, being contentious and trying to have a rule, there's no relationship there. He's trying to restrain her, she's trying to rule over him, and it's going to be a constant battle. There's no joy in that relationship. And that's part of the whole point in using that expression, a continual dripping on a rainy day. It's just irritating. It's just annoying. Don't be that in your marriage relationship where you're fighting for one thing and he's fighting for another, and it's a constant battle. Paul said in Colossians 3 to the husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh. Depending on your translation, again, it may use harsh, it might use bitter, it might use angry. The idea of that word about being harsh to your husband is interesting. It comes from the idea of a point, like on a spear or an arrow. So it's a weapon. Don't be harsh. Don't be pointed with your wife. Don't be sharp with your wife. So it has the idea of someone who is exasperated, of someone who is bitter, someone who is irritated. Have I ever looked at Connie and thought, that really irritates me about her? It's sad, but it's true. This is one of the admonishments that as husbands, we really need to take to heart. As difficult as it is for women to submit to us, when we are sharp and bitter and exasperated with our wives, there's a reason they don't want to submit to us. There's a reason that we make it more difficult by our own attitudes and our own heart. Look in Proverbs 31, the passage that talks so much about the virtuous woman, the excellent wife. Who can find her? Do you know there's references to the husband in this passage about who he is? And they're really important. Proverbs 31, verse 11. The heart of her husband trusts in her, and he will have no lack of gain. Trust is a two-way street in a marriage relationship. If you will trust your wife, if you will assume the best about what she's doing and why she's doing it, it is going to help your wife. Wives, make sure that your husband can trust you. Don't hide things. Don't keep secrets. Don't try to make things more difficult. Make it so that your husband can easily trust in you and all the things that you do. If you look down in verse 28, Proverbs 31, verse 28, her children rise up and call her blessed. Her husband also, and he praises her. See your wife as a blessing in your life. Sometimes that's hard for us men. We forget to do that. We get so busy that it's just like the couch we like to sit in. It's there and it serves its purpose, but it's just there. Don't treat your wife that way. See your wife as a blessing. And what that means, what he says here, is you need to rise up, call her blessed, you need to praise her, affirm her, let her know, not just that you love her, but that you respect her, that you appreciate what she does, that you enjoy the relationship together. Okay, go back to Proverbs, the 5th chapter. He uses another expression in verse 19. Let her breast fill you at all times with delight. We need to delight in our spouse. This is a choice that we have to make. It's a choice, actually, that when you're married, you made a long time ago. We need to remember that choice, that we delight in one another. And I feel like the distinction here is, at least as far as my struggle is, that it's so easy to become nitpicky. It becomes so easy to see the faults and the deficiencies that we forget to see the overall beauty and delight in that. We rather need to look and see the good. Look for reasons not to be nitpicky, but look for reasons to love one another. Before others, I should always uphold my spouse. Never should I put my spouse down in the presence of others. I don't care what they've done. Uphold them as being someone special. One of the things, though, that this passage makes me think about when he says, let her breast fill you at all times with delight, is how do you look at each other? When you look at each other eye to eye and together, how do you look at each other? Do you look at each other with that look that says, well, I barely tolerate you? Or do you look at each other with delight? It's a choice that you have to make. This is one of the parts that's delight. Is, to me, fits very well with the idea of the work spouse in the sense that you turn to each other first for help. You turn to each other first for comfort. You turn to each other first because you delight in sharing with each other. So this is the first person you turn to is your spouse. So we need to choose, as far as rejoicing and delighting, we need to choose to be engaged with each other. Don't let the distractions of life keep you from spending both quality and quantity time together. time on electronic devices, whether you're sitting at the table, you're in the car, whether it's with your phone or your PS4 or your TV, that can distract where one of you is involved but the other one is not involved. It might be reading a book. It doesn't have to be electronic, okay? Make special time with each other. When you set aside all the other distractions and you sit down and you talk and you pray, you study your Bibles, that's delighting in each other. Not just we're comfortable doing our own thing in the same space, but we're delighting in being together and helping each other in life and our relationships with God and all the things that we do. Don't you love the expression intoxicated that's also in verse 19? Be intoxicated always in your love. Your translation may use enraptured. And of course, the idea is of drunkenness. Are you drunk on your wife? Are you drunk on your husband? Are you into them? This kind of fits with the contentment that we talked about earlier, doesn't it? That if you're intoxicated, if you're enraptured with your spouse, there's not going to be a wandering eye. There's not going to be a desire to look at pornography or watch movies that are wrong or TV shows or read books or romances that feel that desire that aren't for your spouse. A lot of times when we're doing those things, we're looking for what's missing in our spouses. And it just feeds that lust. Are you being faithful to your wife? Are you being faithful to your husband when you're engaged in those kind of things that fill those desires? Rejoicing and delighting and being intoxicated means that you don't threaten to leave your wife or your spouse by your words or your actions. Give assurance, we're one flesh, we're together. There's no statement that says, well, if you do this, I'm going back home to mom and dad. There's no statement that says, if you do that, I'm out of this relationship. Don't give in to that. That doesn't say faithfulness to a spouse. That doesn't demonstrate it in any sense. Solomon continues by asking in verse 20, why should you be intoxicated, my son, with a forbidden woman? Be intoxicated with your wife, not with someone else. We could use the word infatuated. We could use all kinds of words there where we're distracted away from. What is it about the strange woman? She's different, right? Maybe she looks different. Maybe there's that sense of excitement that we don't have because we're not working on a marriage. Maybe it's the attention that she gives. And he says, why should you be enraptured with the forbidden, the strange, the woman that's not your woman? Because you're a one-woman man, right? Why should you be intoxicated with her when you have your own wife? Drink from your own well. Drink from your own sister. So we have to be so careful how we interact with others of the opposite sex. Again, this hits very hard with the idea of the work spouse, doesn't it? Why should you be enraptured with that person? You're with them 8 hours a day. How much time do you actually spend with your spouse? You're giving away that which should belong to your wife. The last thing that he talks about, the last point that I want to make, is the idea of the discipline that we need. One way that we can show faithfulness to our spouses is by being disciplined in our relationship. He says it this way, for a man's ways are before the eyes of Jehovah, and he ponders all his past. The iniquities of the wicked ensnare him, and he is held fast in the cords of his sin. He dies for his lack of discipline, and because of his great folly, he is led astray. The first part of this tells us that in any relationship, you need to consider the consequences. That your ways are seen by God, you're not getting away with anything. And again, let me emphasize, even if that anything is lust in the heart, if it's the intimacy of a work spouse, you're not getting away with anything. God knows. Do you notice how he talks about it in this passage? It's a trap. And it's not just a trap, it's a trap that will kill you. So part of this discipline that he's talking about is looking beyond the momentary pleasure of the sin, looking beyond the infatuation, looking beyond the differences, Jehovah sees it, you're not getting away with it, and you have something better at home that you need to focus on. So you notice the contrast that he makes in verse 23 is between discipline and foolishness. If you're not drinking from your own cistern, you're a fool. Show discipline. The problem that we have with this is opportunities may abound, and it's so easy for us to rationalize and justify. You have to be so careful to have that discipline. Now, if you look in the 5th chapter of Proverbs, beginning in verse 3, you'll notice he gives us some very clear consequences, some reasons for having this discipline, in case you're not sure about it. So, beginning in verse 3, it says, "For the lips of a forbidden woman drip honey, and her speech is smoother than oil." So we get, first of all, the picture of this forbidden woman is she's attractive. There's something about her that draws you to her. But, verse 4, "But in the end," and this is where discipline comes in, isn't it? This is where considering the consequences come in. "She looks like honey, but," what's the contrast? "But in the end, she's bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. Her feet go down to death. Her steps follow the path to Sheol. She does not ponder the path of life, for her ways wander, and she does not know it." What are the consequences? Looks like honey, is bitter, leads to death. She doesn't know what she's doing. She's not going to lead you to life. And that's what we should have. He continues in verse 7. "And now, O son, listen to me, and do not depart from the words of my mouth. Keep your way far from her, and do not go near the door of her house. Don't tempt yourself." This fits nowadays, where then it would be, don't go near the house of the adulterous woman. This fits nowadays with the work spouse. Don't have that intimate relationship, and don't push yourself towards that intimate relationship. Stay away from that. That's very dangerous. That's discipline. Do not go near her house, lest you give your honor to others, and your years be merciless, lest strangers take their fill of your strength, and your labors go to the house of a foreigner, and at the end of your life you groan, when your flesh and your body are consumed, and you say, "How I hated discipline, and my heart despised reproof. I did not listen to the voice of my teachers, nor incline my ear to my instructors. I am at the brink of utter ruin in the assembled congregation." Looks like honey, is bitter. Discipline yourself so you don't get ruined. Everything will be taken away. It always leads to some kind of disaster. Look in the 7th chapter, still with the same topic in mind of dealing with adultery. The 7th chapter, beginning in verse 21. In this case, it's a young man who's tempted to go to an adulteress, and he's trying to teach him the discipline that he needs. It says of her, "With much seductive speech she persuades him, and with her smooth talk she compels him." I think this is an important part that we need to recognize, that not all adultery is about how people look. Sometimes it's about the talk and about the relationship, about the intimacy that's there. That's what this woman is doing. She talks a good talk. Men can do that too, by the way, right? So he goes on. "All at once he follows her, and as an ox goes to the slaughter, or as a stag is caught fast till an arrow pierces its liver, a bird rushes into a snare he does not know that it will cost him his life." Again, it's a trap. We see that in this passage. I love how we have that connection with the stag. Think of your wife as the lovely and graceful doe, and now you're a stag caught in a trap. Be careful. The way someone looks, the way that they talk to you, that can all pull you into something that's going to lead to a trap. And it's going to cost you your life. Verse 24, "And now, O sons, listen to me and be attentive to the words of my mouth. Let not your heart turn aside to her ways, and do not stray into her paths. For many a victim has she laid low, and all her slain are a mighty throng. Her house is the way to Sheol, going down to the chambers of death." We need that discipline, don't we? And that discipline says, I know what she is, I know what she's doing, and I know where it goes to. I'm going to leave. rejoicing in the wife of my youth. So, how can you demonstrate faithfulness in your marriage? I think Solomon gives us 3 ways that we can do that, ways that are worthy of us each thinking about in our marriage. I think this is just a beginning, don't you? Be content, rejoice, and be disciplined. So next week's lesson, because apparently I way over-prepared. Next week's lesson is going to be, how do I demonstrate my faithfulness to my God? And as important as this lesson is, next week's is more important. Have you ever asked yourself that question? How am I demonstrating to God that I am faithful to Him? I know He's faithful to me. What am I doing to show Him? So that's what we'll talk about next week. I had no idea I would do this to you guys. I'm sorry. I appreciate your willingness to listen. I hope this has helped you in thinking about the relationships that you have. Demonstrate faithfulness this week with your spouse. If you have the desire this morning because you have studied God's Word and you know that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and you want to be saved from your sins and enter into a right relationship with God, you can do that. If you believe in Him, repent of your sins, be baptized, your sins are washed away, your sins are forgiven, and you become His child. If you have that desire, please come forward as we stand and sing.